Welcome to this episode of Intellectual Catholicism. Today, I'm here with two good friends of mine. To my, screen right is Ben Bollinger, and down below is Kyle King. It's so great to have you guys here. Kyle, you have your own YouTube channel and podcast, Barrel Age Faith, and so a lot of good, high quality content there. And Ben, I know that you have your Substack, and I think I have other things linked in the description. So, gentlemen, it's good to see you this evening. How are you?
Doing well, yeah. Thanks for having us on.
Great to be with you guys tonight. Yes, it'll be a fun night.
Indeed.
Yes, it's my pleasure to host you. So, just to give a rundown for the audience, just a few things to get out of the way, like in terms of preliminary comments and definitions, and also just the structure of the conversation. The first thing is like the debate is not on like the validity or goodness of celibacy. East and West agrees that there is beauty and goodness to that. Despite what some of our, evangelical brethren might think on that particular subject. But we're all in agreement here that there's goodness and beauty there. The question that we're looking at are specifically two lines from Ben Bollinger's article on Catholic Answers. And just a forewarning, I guess, to the audience, you might end up being bored because they're going to probably, Kyle and Ben have indicated to me that they're going to agree on a lot of things. But there are just some minor details here and there that are maybe significant that will become the subject of conversation. So let me just kind of read out a few things and get your thoughts on them. So basically, Kyle, said to me and in the chat, for me, I'm debating / responding to these two lines from the Catholic Answers article. Trullo is deviating from the historic practice of the Church of both East and West, which, going back to Nicaea, was to mandate perfect continence amongst all clerics. That was Ben speaking, and now here's Ben's other line that Kyle is wanting to look at. Thus, if we take the fathers as authoritative interpreters of Scripture, we must conclude that, although the apostles may not have required clerical celibacy as the Church does today, they did require a kind of clerical continence. Since the days of the apostles, a cleric, whether married or not, was expected to refrain from sexual activity during his pastorate. So before I go to Ben, Kyle, is that fair? Like those are the two lines that you're really focusing on?
Yeah, that would be like Trullo deviating from Nicaea, and then also Nicaea codifying what was before that as apostolic tradition from Ben's point of view, that all clerics, deacons, presbyters, and bishops were all mandated to be celibate or practicing marital continence.
And Ben, in the group chat, he responded and he would say, yes, I would certainly argue from Nicaea onwards, continence was a mandated law. Prior to Nicaea, I view the continence requirement as similar to fasting requirements. It was simply so presumed to be the norm that nobody thought to enshrine it into law until it came under fire around the 4th century, same for fasting laws. So in that sense, I'd say the continence requirement goes back to the apostles, but Ben's open to possibly softening that claim. Ben, do you want to go into the definitions of like celibacy versus clerical continence? Explain some of these terms for us.
100%, yeah. Because I think there's a lot of people who have not been, studying this subject, intensely for the past month or two. And it can be confusing sometimes what we're talking about. So obviously the modern law of the Latin Catholic Church is clerical celibacy, which is to say that for priests and bishops, it is married men cannot be ordained as priests and bishops, right? So marriage is what's called a canonical impediment to holy orders, at least for priest and bishop in the modern Latin discipline. And that is distinguished from clerical continence, which is a word we'll be using a lot throughout these discussions, which means regardless of marital status. So this means you can be somebody who's either, not married, in which case you're celibate, or if you are married, a clerical continence requirement would mean that you live with your wife as if she were your sister, right? You live with her as someone you're not having marital relations with, right? As brother and sister is the terminology we often see surrounding continence in the patristic literature or sometimes canonical literature. So the debate here is not whether or not there were married clerics in the early church. Nobody disputes that, yes, there were married clerics in the early church. I know St. Peter was married. I'm aware. That's not the point of contention, right? The point of contention is more specifically whether or not a cleric was married after they were ordained. After he was ordained, did he have to refrain from marital relations after his ordination, right? So that is what's called the law of continence. And obviously something like celibacy is just a modern discipline that kind of safeguards this law of continence, so to speak. And so we can go into more detail about that, but hopefully that point is a little bit clarifying.
Yeah, and Ben, you wanted to talk about too the different practices of Trullo and the West. Do you want to do that now, or do you want to save that for your presentation?
I think I could say for the presentation. I mean, I can just say also like the debate here is not about is one church's practice illegitimate and horrific in the eyes of God and needs to be abolished. Like nobody here is arguing that one church's practice should overthrow the other church's practice because the other one's like an abomination in the eyes of God or something. That's not at all this discussion, right? We both agree that, I mean, even the Eastern churches, as we'll see at Trullo, they did not just have absolutely nothing to say about clerical continence. There is a kind of clerical continence present even in the Eastern churches. It's more a distinction about, to what extent did that go, if that makes sense. And I think that'll become more clear as the discussion goes on. So that's why, you mentioned we might, Kyle and I will probably end up agreeing a lot more than we disagree, at least on matters of theology. Historical matters might be a bit different, but matters of theology, I think, be a lot of agreement.
Yeah, and I was going to add that, you hear people kind of throw the whole phrase clerical celibacy or clerical continence, and it's important that we're also kind of being careful with our words, because the Orthodox tradition obviously has clerical celibacy because our bishops are celibate. And so if you hear people online saying that's, a horrible practice or an innovation, well, you have to be very careful. I mean, I'm fine with people having a debate about the Middle Ages and having debates about how things went down. Was it good? Was it the best practice, best choice? But you don't want to just say the phrase clerical, celibacy is just bad when we have our bishops are like that. So again, we just got to be very careful.
100%.
All right. Are there any other clarifications or kind of definitions you want to go into? Or are you kind of satisfied and ready to go?
I think that about covers it on my end.
Yeah, Kyle,
yeah, I think we should just get in. If people have more questions, if they come into the live show and they don't know what we're talking about, they should go read some articles or read them after the show. But anyways, that's just the nature of YouTube. So let's rock and roll.
Yeah.
All right. So the format is just going to be 30-minute presentations from first Ben and then Kyle. And then afterwards, we'll have 30 minutes of dialogue between the two of them. And then we'll get into audience questions with the 15 minutes that we have left at the end. And with that, when you hit about maybe, I'm going to say like when you actually run out of time, that's when I'm going to hop in and just say time. I don't know if I want to like interrupt somebody 5 minutes before they're done.
Yeah, and I'm gonna have a timer. I was just pulling up a timer, so
very good.
I'll be watching the time myself. So.
Yep. All right. Well, Ben, once you start speaking, I'll start my timer and I'll remove me and Kyle. Or actually, no, I'll keep us. Yeah, so we can get our facial reactions, to what you're saying, and me throwing popcorn at the screen. No,
for sure. All right.
All right, Ben.
I start my timer. So yes, I've titled my presentation here, Clerical Celibacy, the Apostolic Roots. So I'm just going to dive right into it because I got a lot to cover. So right at the beginning, I just want to make a distinction between two different points I'm going to be defending. They're going to be kind of mixed together throughout my presentation because I obviously believe both of them. But there are nonetheless two distinct points, I think, that I'm going to try and get out of this. And the first one is that there is an apostolic tradition that sexual continence is in some sense intrinsically connected to priestly service. And I view this as the most important point that I'll be defending because it is, I will argue, taught not only by the Western Catholic Church, but even by the Eastern churches, the Eastern Orthodox Church, the Eastern Catholic churches, that there is an apostolic tradition about clerical continence that goes back to the apostles. That is point number one. The second point, which will be the more controversial point, is that the predominant way in which this connection, this between priestly service and sexual continence, was expressed in the early church of both East and West was through requiring perpetual continence for all clerics, regardless of their marital status. So I view this as being of slightly less importance, but nonetheless, I do think it is still relevant to the argumentation. And so I just want to make that clear right at the beginning here. So just to make this point, going over what are the actual Eastern and Western traditions, I have on the left-hand side a papal decretal of the 4th century, which I take to be broadly representative of the Western tradition on clerical continence, and then the 13th canon of the Council of Trullo on the right-hand side to be representative broadly of the Eastern tradition from the 7th century onwards. And something you'll notice is that in the Western tradition, right, there's this idea that there is something unfitting about marital relations for the sacramental service of God. So Pope St. Cyricus says that because it is always necessary for bishops, priests, and deacons to be at the service of the sacraments, and because there is something unfitting about marital relations for the service of the sacraments, this is why bishops, priests, and deacons have to perpetually observe sexual continence, right? And in the Eastern tradition, we see something different, but also not too different from this, right? The Eastern tradition likewise affirms that there is something unfitting about sexual relations in relationship to service of the altar. So the Council of Trullo says that those who handle the holy mysteries should abstain from marital relations, especially during their times of service, right? Because there would be something impure, unfitting about marital relations being in proximity to the altar. The only difference is that in the Eastern tradition, clerics were seen as being only in temporary periods of service at the altar. So unlike in the Western tradition, where clerics were seen to be perpetually serving the altar, so they observe perpetual continence, in the Eastern tradition, we see temporary periods of service at the altar being emphasized, and so therefore temporary periods of continence. However, as I have listed out here, it seems the general theology behind both practices is the same, that there is something about marital relations that make them unfit for sacramental service. And you'll notice too, both the Council of Trullo and the papal decretals of the 4th century identify this as a tradition going back to the apostles. So the Council of Trullo explicitly says that this is a teaching handed down through the apostles, and Pope St. Cyricus also says this is taught in Holy Scripture itself. So obviously going back to the apostles. So both the East and the West are in agreement about clerical continence going back to the apostles. The main disagreement is just about what kind of clerical continence goes back to the apostles. So then, of course, the question should be asked, is this shared tradition of both East and West actually true? Is there a kind of clerical continence that actually goes back to the apostles? If so, what kind? The first point I want to make is that not only do we see clerical continence going back to the apostles, but it's actually a pre-apostolic tradition. So this connection between sexual continence and the service of the altar, some scholars try to say that this is originating from pagan cults around the time of the emergence of Christianity, but we also see it in the Old Testament itself. We see it in places like Exodus 19, right? The descent of God on Mount Sinai. Moses tells his men to stay away from their wives for 3 days. Notice this happens before the Sinai covenant is cut. So this predates the Mosaic law, this connection between sexual continence and experiencing what I've called here the unique presence of God. We see this also in the Levitical law. Priests, at least for 1 day, we know had to abstain from marital relations. Otherwise, they would defile the tabernacle with uncleanness. And we see this also in the curious story in 1 Samuel, where David and his men have to have abstained from women in order to encounter the holy bread of presence from the priest when David was on the run from Saul. So there is this idea, even in pre-apostolic times, of the connection between sexual continence and experiencing the unique presence of God. And we see this being continued into apostolic times. So in the New Testament itself, how does the Son of God enter creation? He enters not through marital relations, but through the power of the Holy Spirit, right? It's emphasized that he is born of a virgin, right? Why is that? It's almost as if there's this continuation of this idea that marital relations are unfit for the unique presence of God. We see this also manifest in the mutual belief of the Eastern and Western churches that the Mother of God was consecrated to perpetual virginity, right? It would not be far off to say that in the Eastern and Western traditions, if the Virgin Mary had engaged in marital relations after giving birth to Christ, this would have been seen as a kind of defilement of the temple of her body, right? Once again, expressing this principle that marital relations are in some sense unfitting for the unique presence of God. And there's of course also the fact that Jesus, the God-man himself, refuses to engage in marital relations, right? That is not an area of our human experience that he chooses to embrace as the God-man himself personally in his actions. Another thing I would point out is I do believe there is an apostolic tradition that the apostles themselves lived lives of continence. I don't have time to really go over all the evidence for this. Perhaps we can talk about this in the discussion. But I do think texts like Matthew 19 and Luke 18 do show the apostles leaving everything behind to follow Christ. I know there are some arguments against this. I don't think that they quite work. Once again, we can bring this up in the discussion. But most relevant for our purposes, I would point out that it is as far as I've seen, and I'm open to correction on this, it is a unanimous consensus of the church fathers that the apostles themselves imitated Christ in practicing perfect continence. So even though many of the apostles were married, it is both the Eastern and the Western traditions believe that after their apostolic calling, they all practice marital continence. You see this in the East with St. Clement of Alexandria, St. Isidore of Pelusium, Eusebius of Caesarea, and in the West, you see it with St. Jerome and Tertullian. It seems, at least in my reading, to be unanimous patristic teaching on this. So just to give a summary of clerical continence in Scripture, we see the Old and the New Testaments are in agreement that marital relations are in some way unfit for the unique presence of God. In the Old Testament, one of the primary ways this was expressed was through at least temporary periods of priestly continence. And in the New Testament, we see the same principle being expressed through perpetual continence, whether that be of the Blessed Virgin Mary, of Jesus Christ, our high priest, or the apostles, his priestly ministers. So that kind of just gives a background of this practice in Scripture. But of course, this raises the question of, okay, well, what about the New Testament requirements for the priesthood, right? Because we don't just have these theological things to go off of. We have actual concrete requirements for priesthood in the New Testament. What are we to make of this in light of these things? The first point I want to make, just broadly speaking, is an observation St. Paul makes about marital relations themselves. In 1 Corinthians 7, he states that marriage, engaging in the marital act, right, engaging in marital relations, in a sense, reflects a deficiency or a lack of self-control, right? So Paul talks about how husbands and wives, they should abstain from marital relations for a certain period of time, right, so that they can enter deeper into prayer. So there's a manifestation of that same principle that abstaining from marital relations allows you to enter deeper into the presence of God. And then his reason for coming back to marital relations, the actual reason he gives is because of your lack of self-control, right? So that Satan may not tempt you. So too, in his discussion of whether or not the unmarried should get married, he says the reason you should get married is if you lack self-control. So for St. Paul, there's something about actively engaging in marital relations that reflects a lack of self-control. And this is interesting when we get to St. Paul's requirements for clerics in 1 Timothy 3, which is that he be self-controlled, right? A bishop must be above reproach, the husband of one wife, sober-minded and self-controlled. And what's interesting is that if I'm reading Paul correctly here, one might begin to notice a tension in Paul's thought between the bishop being self-controlled and him being the husband of one wife. Because obviously if St. Paul believes an active married life is a reflection of a lack of self-control, how can he say that a bishop ought to have an active married life and also be self-controlled? And what's interesting is that it seems like St. John Chrysostom, who is a doctor of the church, of especially the Eastern Church, especially on the topic of marriage. He talks a lot about the theology of marriage. He praises the goodness of marriage and all these things. St. John Chrysostom, in his commentary on 1 Timothy, notices exactly this tension in St. Paul's thought, right? So he notices that on the one hand, a bishop is not supposed to be concerned with the things of the world, but on the other hand, a married man is concerned about the things of the world. So how, for St. John Chrysostom, does this get resolved? It gets resolved by Chrysostom interpreting that phrase, the husband of one wife, as either referring to a widower, so a man who only married one time and whose wife has now passed on, fallen asleep in the Lord. And so now he lives a celibate life as a widower, or it refers to a man who is currently married and who is living a life of continence, right? So this is how St. John Chrysostom is interpreting 1 Timothy 3. And yes, he will go on to develop what perhaps we can call a positive theology of the married priesthood, about how, being a good manager of your household makes you a good manager of the church, but it's not to the detriment of this point about clerical continence. And what is interesting is that interpretation of the husband of one wife as referring to the fact that a cleric cannot remarry after the death of his spouse, not simply that he practiced monogamy, is the universal teaching of the church fathers as well. The only two dissenters from this interpretation that I have been able to find were the Nestorians, or at least perhaps former Nestorians, Theodore of Mopsuestia and Theodoret of Cyrus. It seems everyone aside from these two interpreted St. Paul's words as referring to I believe bigamy is the term, right? Remarriage after the death of a spouse. And there's also a parallel between this and 1 Timothy 5, right, where Paul talks about the requirements of the order of widows, so-called, and it says that a widow who is to be enrolled ought to have been the wife of one husband, right? So obviously that doesn't mean she's currently married because she's a widow, and it also doesn't mean that she was monogamous because there was no such thing as misandry in the Greco-Roman world. Instead, it means she never remarried after the death of her husband. And so, too, we see a parallel in 1 Timothy 3. The husband of one wife means that the bishop never remarried after the death of his wife. And so that raises the question of, okay, well, why could only once married men become clerics? Well, consider the case of the widow. Why was it that a widow who is to be enrolled had to have only been married once? It's because it demonstrated her ability to handle a life of continence in the order of widows. So right in the New Testament, we have precedent for this idea that where there is a requirement to only have been married once, it's in order to prove that you're fit for living a continent life. And so this, I would argue, also applies to clerics, that it is implicit in the command for a bishop to be a one-woman man, so to speak, that he was to live a continent life, because the fact that he didn't remarry after his wife died showed that he could handle the life of continence that the priestly ministry demanded of him. And of course, this would also be in very good continuity with the Old Testament's practice, or at least its regulation of marital relations in connection with the altar. And this would be in continuity with Jesus's practice of perpetual celibacy and the apostles' practice of perpetual continence. So now, of course, big question, is there any evidence of this tradition before Nicaea 1? Before the Council of Nicaea, because it's often claimed that there was no law forbidding clerical marital relations until the 4th century. Well, a point that I want to make is that, at least in my research, and once again, I'm here to learn. I am here to test my research and such things as this. But as far as I've seen, the reverse is also true. There is no law permitting clerics to use their marital rights prior to the 4th century either, right? And I would argue that this silence about the permission of clerics to use their marital rights is indeed a loud silence, so-called, because of everything we've talked about, because of the precedent of continence set by the Old and New Testaments, because of this apostolic ban on widowers remarrying, and also because there is ample evidence of clerical continence being the norm in the pre-Nicene church. So the first piece of evidence I bring out is obviously Eusebius of Caesarea. So in his discussion of how Christianity, in a sense, has a general disregard for marriage, one of the pieces of evidence he brings out for this is just the ordinary practice of clerical continence, right? He says it is fitting that those who in the service of the priesthood should abstain after ordination from the intercourse of marriage, right? He's not defending this. He's not bringing this out as something striking, something unique, something new. He's just mentioning this in passing, as if it's just the most normal thing in the world. And so he has pre-Nicene evidence in the Eastern Church, no less, that clerical continence was the norm. We see this also in Tertullian of Carthage. Tertullian, he's commenting on people. He says he's talking about both men and women who were rose to ecclesiastical orders. So obviously in the case of women, he's talking about deaconesses, which perhaps we'll talk about that, but that's a whole can of worms in itself. But what Tertullian points out is that there are many women and men in the early church who, because they lived lives of continence, because they were not having marital relations prior to their ordination, this is what judged them fit for holy orders. This is what made people say, oh, these people would be perfect for holy orders, right? The fact that they were living lives of continence before their ordinations. And so this would make sense only in a context in a pre-Nicene Western church where clerical continence is a requirement for the clerical state. We see this also in Origen of Alexandria, right? In his commentaries on his homilies on Leviticus, he, interestingly enough, anticipates the arguments of Pope St. Innocent I, who argues that the Old Covenant's requirements for priestly continence were intensified by the New Covenant, right? And so Origen is obviously attesting to the discipline of clerical continence in 3rd century Alexandria. And so then this brings me to my next point so we have this evidence for clerical continence in the pre-Nicene era. Do we have anything on the flip side? Do we have any evidence for non-continence before Nicaea? Obviously, the text most people are going to bring out to this effect is St. Clement of Alexandria, who I would argue is the only pre-Nicene text I've seen that can legitimately be defended as supporting clerical non-continence. And obviously, I'm no Greek expert, so I can't determine the merits of what the proper translation is. I will simply note that there's two ways to translate the disputed text in St. Clement. In one of the translations, the first one I have on screen, he says that the Apostle Paul allows the husband of an only wife, whether he be a priest, deacon, or layman, to use his marriage irreproachably, which would seem to attest to clerical non-continence in the pre-Nicene church. However, another possible translation of that is that Paul accepts the husband of an only wife, whether he be a priest, a deacon, or a layman, using his marital rights. So in this case, Clement would actually be presupposing the discipline of clerical continence because he's explicitly distinguishing between the priest and the deacon and the layman who's using his marital rights. So obviously, I cannot speak to the merits of the particular Greek translation, but something to keep in mind about Clement is just his view of marriage in general, right? So for Clement, like most of the early patristic writers, their view of marriage was basically you would be having children for a set amount of time, and then after a certain amount of time, you would cease engaging in the marital act. After you've raised your household, after you've managed your household well, you cease engaging in the marital act. And something that's interesting is that Clement will go on to say that bishops are only chosen after they've proven themselves to be wise household managers. So after they've already had their children. So it seems, at least prima facie, Clement is not envisioning a clerical married state where there's an active married life. The cleric just had a couple of children. He's got more children. He got another child on the way. He's planning on having more children in the future. Clement seems to be envisioning a man who is a little bit more seasoned of a father than that. There's also just other things to consider. The fact that Origen of Alexandria, who is a fellow 3rd century Alexandrian, the fact that he rejected clerical non-continence, and the fact that there is no known conflict in the 3rd century Alexandrian church over this issue would seem to suggest that perhaps Clement agreed with Origen on clerical continence. There's also the fact that, like Origen, Eusebius, and Tertullian, Clement himself upholds apostolic continence, which is interesting because that even seems to go against his own arguments that he's making in defense of the goodness of marriage. He still feels compelled to defend the fact that the apostles remain perpetually continent. And there's also the interesting detail where Clement appears to compare the apostles' wives to the wives of deacons. I believe I have that on the next slide. So we could talk about that more in the discussion. But at the end of the day, if this is an example of clerical non-continence before Nicaea, I would argue it's the only explicit example. It's even a lone dissenting voice within the 3rd century Church of Alexandria, and therefore this alone cannot establish that clerical non-continence was an apostolic tradition. There's a couple other examples that perhaps we could talk about in the discussion. There's the Council of Ancyra. There's the St. Hippolytus. I don't think either of these really provide great evidence for non-continence in the pre-Nicene era, but perhaps Kyle will prove me wrong on that, or we can talk about it. But either way, the summary that I have of clerical continence in the pre-Nicene era, we see that clerical continence is the presumed norm in both the East and the West. We have Eusebius and Origen in the East. We have Tertullian in the West, right? This is not defended. This is not under attack. This is just the presumed norm. And I would say we have zero conclusive evidence of clerical non-continence, right? And so given the weight of the evidence, given the way the evidence looks, I think this lends itself more, the evidence in the pre-Nicene church lends itself more to clerical continence, understood as perpetual continence being the norm or being the law of the pre-Nicene church. Then, of course, there's a question, well, why wasn't this a written law? As we mentioned at the beginning of this the stream, nobody thought it was necessary to write it down, right? I think there's an analogy to be drawn with fasting laws. We don't see any fasting laws until the 4th century either. Obviously, yes, we have things like the Didache, which talk about fasting on Wednesdays and Fridays, but that's not a law, as we understand law today. That's not a canonical law, right, with penalties assigned to it and such things as this. But it's still not just something that you could ignore, right? It was, in a sense, a kind of requirement. It was a kind of like law that wasn't fully codified. And there's also an interesting analogy to be drawn with the medieval Third Order Dominicans. In the Middle Ages, the medieval Third Order Dominicans, there was a celibacy requirement to become a Third Order Dominican. This is well known among historians of the Middle Ages. There's not a single example of a married member of the medieval Third Order. And yet, in all the rules of life that we have of the Third Order Dominicans, a celibacy requirement is never mentioned. And the explanation given is because it was so well presumed, nobody bothered to write it down. I think there's an analogy to be drawn with that and clerical continence in the pre-Nicene church. And so then let's talk about what happened at the Council of Nicaea, right? So we talked about the pre-Nicene era. What happens at the Council of Nicaea? In the third canon of the Council of Nicaea, we have this very interesting and disputed text, which says that bishops, priests, and deacons are not allowed to have any sister companions dwelling with them, except only someone that they're related to, so a mother, sister, aunt, or such persons as are beyond all suspicion. Right. So I will acknowledge at the beginning, this text is disputed by scholars. So I don't want to pretend that I'm going to be resolving this debate, debate about among scholars, like what does this actually mean? However, let's just look at what it says. It's clearly concerning the women who are allowed to live with a cleric. Right. And so I just find it interesting right off the bat that a wife is not on that list. Right. It was obvious to the fathers of Nicaea that, oh, of course, a mother, an aunt, a sister is not going to raise suspicion if she lives with the cleric. And yet a wife is not on that list. So why is the wife not on that list? Well, I think the best explanation is that the wife has to be in that category of women who are beyond all suspicion. So that means that there was something, according to the fathers of Nicaea, a wife living with her ordained husband, there was something to suspect her of. And what was there to suspect her of except that she was having relations with her husband? I think this is the best explanation for Canon 3 of Nicaea in context. And so I do believe that this is a codification of the pre-Nicene norm of clerical continence into law. So we talked about how in the pre-Nicene era, this was the norm, right? So this is just still being presumed by the fathers of Nicaea, and through Canon 3, they're even giving this the force of law, I would argue. And I would say that this is how the canon was universally received in the Western Church. So I don't have time to go through all the examples. We could talk more about this in the discussion, but I would argue in the churches of Carthage, Spain, Gaul, and especially Rome, we see Canon 3 of Nicaea being interpreted in just this way. And obviously it's in immediate reaction to the 4th century, to the Council of Nicaea, that we begin to see all of the first laws mandating clerical continence in the West, right? All the fathers who did that were claiming to be doing so in fidelity to the Council of Nicaea. And I would also argue that we see Canon 3 being received this way even in the East. So St. Epiphanius of Salamis is an interesting case because he, in the post-Nicene East, he notes that there are areas of the church where clerics are being non-continent, and he says this is a violation of the canons. Now, Epiphanius is writing in Greek to a Greek-speaking audience. So what canons is Epiphanius talking about? There are no Greek canons about clerical continence at this time. The only canon that he could possibly be referring to is Canon 3 of Nicaea. So it seems Epiphanius understood Canon 3 of Nicaea this way. I think it's implicit in St. Cyril of Jerusalem, who's, I don't know if he's a contemporary of St. Epiphanius, but living around the same time, around the same place. He just notes in passing that his catechumens were aware that priests had to observe continence. This was just a well-known thing. It's assumed, it's not defended, gives credence to this idea that this is how Canon 3 is being received in the East. And also the witness of St. Jerome. We think of St. Jerome as a Western saint, but he's very well traveled throughout the East. He traveled throughout Antioch, Palestine, and Egypt. And in his work against Vigilantius, he explicitly attests in the post-Nicene era that mandating clerical continence was the practice of the churches of the East, the Egyptian churches, and the churches under the discipline of Rome. So once again, was Jerome making this up? Was he misinformed? These are questions that we have to work into our models of history. There's also something we could talk about, which is there seemed to be a Persian synod in the 5th century that also seems to be interpreting Canon 3 of Nicaea as explicitly mandating clerical continence. Perhaps we could talk about that. But it seems that, yes, this is how Canon 3 is being received in both the West and the East. Okay, so now what about the story, the legend, as I call it, of St. Paphnutius? So for those who don't know, there's a legend comes about 100 years after Nicaea, that there was a bishop at Nicaea named St. Paphnutius who stood up and forbade a clerical continence mandate for bishops, priests, and deacons. And he stopped the Council of Nicaea from enacting this law. So what are we to make of the legend of St. Paphnutius, given everything I've talked about? Well, the first thing to know is there's a couple of historical points, right? Paphnutius, from the earliest sources, we know he wasn't a bishop. His name is missing from the most reliable lists of the Council of Nicaea, so it's possible he wasn't even at the Council of Nicaea. But that aside, here are some things to consider. Obviously, if my interpretation of Canon 3 of Nicaea is correct, this would mean that the legend of St. Paphnutius is contradicting one of the canons of Nicaea, which would obviously mean that it's a fabrication. There's also the fact that if this legend is true, why is it that it is in immediate response to the Council of Nicaea that clerical continence mandates go out all over the West while claiming fidelity to the Council of Nicaea, right? Did everybody in the West did they not know about the story of Paphnutius? Did they just forget about the story of Paphnutius? How do we make that case? There's also the fact that this legend forbids continence mandates, not only for priests and deacons, but for bishops as well. So the legend of St. Paphnutius contradicts even the later Eastern discipline, which gets codified at the Council of Trullo. And so there's also the fact that the Council of Trullo itself, when it is relaxing the discipline of continence. So once again, we must emphasize, Trullo does not get rid of this law of continence. Trullo instead relaxes the law, right? It moves it from being perpetual continence to temporary continence. It doesn't remove the law of continence. And it cites precedents for doing this. And obviously, I would argue Trullo misrepresents and misinterprets all of the precedents that it cites. And yet, it does not cite the legend of St. Paphnutius as one of its precedents, right? So why doesn't Trullo cite the legend of St. Paphnutius? Some might point out, well, the legend of St. Paphnutius contradicts Trullo's practice of episcopal celibacy or continence. And that's true, but so would their interpretation of Apostolic Canon 6, right? So Trullo is not avoiding misinterpreting and misrepresenting sources, right? Even if it contradicts their own practice. So that alone cannot explain why Trullo does not cite the legend of St. Paphnutius. Instead, I think the best explanation is that nobody in the 7th century believed that the legend of St. Paphnutius was authentic, and that's why the Council of Trullo doesn't cite it. Not only doesn't the Council of Trullo, but we don't see this legend come up again until the 11th century. Not a single person mentions it until the 11th century, it seems. And then, of course, it gets brought up again later during the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century. So that begs the question, okay, well then why would somebody invent the legend of St. Paphnutius in the 5th century? And I think the obvious answer is that it's because Canon 3 of Nicaea was so widely being interpreted in both the East and the West as being a clerical continence mandate. And obviously in the 4th century, Christianity is growing in popularity. Clerical continence is not a very popular discipline. It's not a very attractive discipline. And yet there's no precedence for relaxing this in the pre-Nicene era, right? Nobody's bringing out St. Clement of Alexandria, right? Nobody's doing these things. Instead, the best someone has to come up with is to invent the story of St. Paphnutius in the 5th century, right? No precedent existed, so one had to be invented in the 5th century. And then my final question here I have is just, why is the Council of Trullo unable to cite any real precedent for its relaxation of the law of continence, right? Why doesn't Council of Trullo bring out St. Clement? Why don't they bring out the legend of St. Paphnutius? Why instead are they only able to misinterpret and misrepresent canonical sources from the 4th century? I think the best explanation is that it's because perpetual continence for all clerics was the original discipline of the church. This is why there's no precedence for relaxing it until the 5th century when we have the invention of the legend of St. Paphnutius, and then the 7th century when we have the official relaxing of the law of continence by the Council of Trullo. So my final slide here, I just want to point out, in conclusion, both the modern Eastern and Western disciplines are legitimate, right? So like I've been emphasizing throughout, nobody is saying that the Eastern churches are, deficient or like they're bad. We need to get them to forcibly change their disciplines or something like this. Right. Nobody's saying that. They're both expressions, right? They're both expressing the law of continence, right? One does it perpetually, one does it for temporary periods of time. However, my historical argument has been that the West, the modern discipline of clerical celibacy, is more closely in alignment with the apostolic tradition of perpetual continence. I also threw in there, Protestants are obviously wrong about this, right? I think we can all agree on this. I think this is showing clerical continence is indeed apostolic. It's attached to the essence of Christianity. And I also don't want to excuse the Latin West from its disciplines either, right? The Latin West has also problems with its discipline of continence, right? What about married deacons? As far as I'm aware, there are currently no laws governing the marital relationships of deacons in the Western Church, right? Not even the laws that exist in the East, right? It seems that the East is actually more strict in its regulation of the marital lives of deacons than the modern West is. We also haven't adequately regulated, what about former Anglican priests who have become Catholic priests, right? Do we have any regulation of their conduct, right? The law of continence extended not just to deacons, but even to subdeacons in the early church, right? So this is something to consider. And I also threw in there lay Eucharistic ministers. I mean, by these standards, lay Eucharistic ministers should absolutely be required to be celibate. So that's a law I'm, firmly in favor of implementing for any bishops, perpetual continence or celibacy for lay Eucharistic ministers. Absolutely. So once again, so the Western practice is not at all free of criticism. Right. I am here just going over the history, and I believe I'm at time there. So yes, thank you.
All right, Ben, thank you. Very good. You hit right at 30 minutes. So I'm going to now move your presentation out, and I will put Kyle's on the screen. All right, and Kyle, just whenever you start talking, I'll start the timer. And let me unmute you real quick, yeah, because just in case I didn't want to get any of our audios, overlapping. Yeah, so Kyle, whenever you want to start, go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Ben. So Ben claims that Trullo Canon 13 broke with Nicaea 1 Canon 3, and that it was universally mandated, and that there was permanent clerical continence required by that. And so Trullo was very innovative with that canon. Secondly, he mentions that Canon 13 broke with apostolic tradition, as he demonstrated just in his presentation, that Trullo is allowing presbyters and deacons and subdeacons to have relations at certain times throughout the week while fasting before the divine liturgy. And so it's breaking with apostolic tradition. I'm going to show that the East and the West have different developments of this discipline, and that there are many echoes and patterns of Trullo's legislation in the history leading up to it. Canon 13, you can just see it right there. Canon 13 basically states that bishops are going to now be taken from the monasteries, and that and will be celibate, but the presbyters and deacons will be able to continue having relations as long as they practice temporal continence, as we've already talked about. So what's at stake in this debate? Well, when we talk about where Ben is kind of like getting many of his sources, it comes from like the works of like Coccini, and then we have Cardinal Stickler, and then there are a few other big players, but they were in many ways players in like the 1980s who were reacting to a big movement after Vatican II to really kind of like open up priestly celibacy in the Latin Church. And so there were a lot of kind of really big liberal arguments trying to get rid of celibacy. And what these guys are doing in the kind of 80s and 90s, they're responding to these guys. And my interpretation is that they overreact. So they overreact with their documentation, and they take much of the 4th century and they try to apply it backwards, where there's a lot of silence, though there are evidences for all sorts of perspectives. So Kevin Doyle talks about Coccini, that claim that Carthage and the Decretals were simply articulating a universally acknowledged law, one viewed as unquestionably reaching back to the apostles. So it does have kind of this weight, Ben's perspective, that it's apostolic tradition in a similar mode to Wednesdays and Fridays. But I will add on the side that I think it's actually closer to the debate around fasting on Saturday, whether the apostles gave that as an indulgence or not. And so the East and parts of the West said that the apostles did not give us a fasting practice on Saturdays, while Carthage and Rome did. And so there was this debate about fasting in the early church when it comes to regional customs, and they each had their own opinions about that. And so I actually think this debate's closer to the fasting on Saturday debate versus the the Wednesday and Friday fast, which was universal. Secondly, writing as a canon lawyer, Cholich, who was like a Ukrainian secretary for the Ukrainian Catholic Church, he produced a bunch of articles, and basically from these articles, it looks like his main claim is that the Western Catholic tradition has alone preserved clerical continence as a primitive tradition. And so, of course, Trullo would be innovating. He also states celibacy, therefore, would be seen to be the natural state for a priest. Now, I don't want to put words in Ben's mouths, but this is much of where his sources are coming from. And so there was this big push in the 80s and 90s for this sort of thing. And it's relevant because Cardinal Sarah, and he wrote a book, of course, with Pope Benedict XVI, Joseph Ratzinger, really kind of arguing for this ontological link between celibacy and the priesthood. That if there isn't celibacy, that there is some kind of polluting of the altar, some kind of defect happening there. Of course, this is worked out differently in the East and West, but there actually is a lot that we could talk about with that. I'm not going to get really deep into that, but there is this claim that there's this strong ontological link going on there. Okay, and so I think that Archbishop Peter wrote an article called "The Episcopal Celibacy in the Orthodox Tradition," gives us a nice kind of like summary about what's kind of going on here, big picture. Therefore, this hypothesis does not bear up critical scrutiny, and he's responding to Coccini, this work here. In the East, during late antiquity, no law was enacted to alter the prevailing custom, and later on, Canon 13 of the Trullan Council emphasizes the legitimacy of marriage for priests, deacons, and subdeacons. This canon confirms and amplifies the previous enactment made by the Synod of Gangra in 343. And so in his summary, he basically says that this does not mean that during the 3rd and 4th centuries, both the East and the West, clerical continence was not advocated by some prominent men, but the East and the West developed differently. And that's really the claim that I'm making as well. As we get into scripture, I mean, St. Paul is writing, first of all, his letter to the Corinthians. He's writing to the presbyters, like those who are running the church. Of course, you've got the apostles appointing presbyters in every church, and the presbyters are basically running matters. And we've got that case of sexual immorality, right? The guy that's sleeping with his stepmom. And he really wants to imply that, like, look, you guys should have dealt with that. And so this letter is being written not just to the laity, but also to the presbyters. And so he's like, you should deal with this. Later on in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, he's also encouraging them to practice. I mean, he doesn't see continence to be a bad thing or to be imitating him, but he does say, do not deprive one another except perhaps by agreement for a set time. So that would be like temporary continence. And he doesn't make any kind of distinction here. Oh, well, but we all know that the presbyters already do this. He doesn't say that. And he's also with this letter addressing the presbyters. So I'm arguing that I think the natural reading of 1 Corinthians 7 really does see presbyters who could be continent, those who are practicing temporal continence, maybe both that are going on there. But I do think that he's allowing for that allowance for presbyters. I just think that's the natural reading of it. And when you get to Clement of Alexandria, I do think that he's kind of following a very similar pattern that's going on there. Paul entirely approves of the man who's a husband of one wife, whether he is a presbyter, deacon, or layman, if he makes use of marriage blamelessly, for he shall be saved by childbearing. Now he gets that phrase, for he shall be saved by childbearing, from what, 2 Timothy. And that was applied to women who were not supposed to be teaching over men. He's like, no, you'll be saved by being a mother, by having children. But here he applies this not only to laymen, but presbyters and deacons, which is interesting. Why? Well, he's fighting, ascetical sects that are practicing radical asceticism, where they're saying marriage is bad, sexual relations are bad. And so he's trying to have a response that, of course, takes self-control and continence seriously, while also allowing for presbyters and deacons to continue having relations. Now, it is possible that he's also kind of echoing Trullo, and I want to give you an example here. I do agree with Ben that I think when he's talking about the apostles, that he's really thinking of them as continent, because he talks about they did bring their wives along, but they brought them along like sisters, which really kind of implies they were no longer thinking about having children. They're spreading throughout the whole world, and they're taking the mission all over the place. But he does say that presbyters can their marriage can make use blamelessly of childbearing, and so can deacons, which kind of looks like a very similar pattern to what we have at Trullo, right? You got bishops who are continent or celibate, while presbyters and deacons can continue having relations. It's also interesting that he doesn't mention bishops. There could be a variety of reasons why he doesn't, but why doesn't he mention bishops with presbyters and deacons? It could be that because in custom, bishops, for the most part, were celibate. Maybe they're being pulled from celibate men. We don't really know for sure, but this could very much be an example of a similar pattern to Trullo. We also have the pseudo-apostolic collection of apostolic canons. They're dated like around 300 AD. And in these canons, it is this collection, it's mentioned that Peter said it's good for the bishop not to be married, or else let him be a husband of only one wife. And then John said there must be priests who would have lived a long time in the world and would abstain in a certain way from relations with their lives. Here's an example that looks like an actual pattern of Trullo. And Caccini, actually, the book that Ben is highly reliant upon, he basically says this alleged canon requires the priest abstain to a certain extent. And he thinks that the more plausible reading of this text is the first option. The second option would be that they're always continent. The temporary continence would be the first option. And he actually thinks, even though this is not in favor of him, of his argument, that this favors the Trullo argument. He even says this is an echo of Trullo. He also says that this was quickly translated, this text, into Latin, Coptic, Arabic, and Ethiopian. And he also notes if they were able to accredit the Christian communities and Christian leaders of this time, it is because they reflected traditions that all knew. So he's saying that as these documents spread, that people are recognizing that this might be the tradition that they have. And so it's a similar pattern. We see bishops who might be, they might not be married. They might be celibate at this time. It's a growing custom that you see in the East, though it's mandated in the West later on in the 4th century councils, so all of them local. And then priests who are abstaining from marriage only to a certain extent for a temporary time. Again, Coccini actually thinks that the most likely plausible reading is what is happening at Trullo. Then we also have the Council of Nicaea, the First Ecumenical Council. Dr. David Hunter really thinks it's unlikely that Canon 3 is referencing a permanent continence for all clergy, subdeacons all the way up. And one of the reasons is like, why didn't later councils explicitly quote this canon? Like, why didn't the Council of Carthage in 390 specifically quote Nicaea? Like, because Nicaea would be a universal canon, whereas Carthage would only be a local one. So if this was like a universal canon, why aren't they quoting it? There's a number of different issues going on here. I mean, it seems to be actually, in his opinion, in my opinion, targeting unmarried clergy living with unrelated women. Why? Because it is popular for bishops more and more to be celibate. And so it would be scandalous to have people that you're not related to accompanying you. So it would make a lot of sense. It's also odd that they're not that they're not quoting an ecumenical canon at these later councils. Then, of course, you have St. Paphnutius of Alexandria. I'm not going to spend much time here. It could be a true story. It could be fabricated. I'm kind of torn either way. Definitely the scholarship thinks that it's mostly fabricated. But it is mentioned, not the same story, but something quite similar by a Latin historian, Rufinus. And he mentions a very similar line that the church historian Socrates says, and that is that Constantine loved him and venerated him and loved him and revered him for being, basically a confessor of the faith. So it's kind of odd that he does reference a story about Rufinus, or by Rufinus, about him. It's also interesting that you could throw this out there that why doesn't he share the story about priests and deacons and bishops being able to use their marital rights? Maybe he's suppressing it because he's writing in the Latin West, which is already beginning to basically legislate that you cannot. So maybe that's one possibility, but we'll put St. Paphnutius aside there. You also have St. Gregory being born. His dad's a married bishop. He's being born in between his father's ordination as priest and episcopal consecration. What's interesting is that there could be a pattern similar to Trullo here, where a presbyter can have relations. Therefore, he has a son, 2 sons. And then by the time he's a bishop, he might be practicing as a custom a type of celibacy or continence. Then we get to the Council of Gangres in 340 AD, and they're reacting to the context, extreme asceticism, where marriage is the groups are saying that marriage is bad. You shouldn't go to church where there's like a married priest and receive communion from him. And this council condemns anybody who will not receive communion from a married priest. Does this automatically explicitly say someone who's continuing relations? It doesn't say that, but it does seem like it leans in that direction. Like it seems more plausible. And Dr. David Hunter also agrees with that. He says it indicates that it was common for presbyters in the region of, let's actually one step ahead. If anyone separates himself from a married presbyter, claiming that it's not necessary to partake of the offering when he's celebrating, let such a one be anathema. And Dr. David Hunter basically says it seems likely that they were continuing to remain sexually active with their wives, and it leans that direction. Then we have the canons of Athanasius of Alexandria, which are canons that were written. It's kind of there's a lot of scholarship being written about. I read 3 or 4 different journal articles. It's also in this book, The 1,000 Years of Coptic Christianity. But these are probably written in the mid to late 4th century, potentially by St. Athanasius, but it could be by somebody later in the 5th century. But this canon 6, talks about priests. The priests must behave themselves according to as the apostles have ordained. Wherefore the bishop must be in nothing blameworthy, married to one wife, vigilant, wise, orderly of understanding heart, apt to teach, not lover of shameful gain, ordering his house well, faithful, true, pure, continent, constant in the right word, steadfast in doctrine. But it continues to say this: and if he's able, let him be continent, for that is better. But if he's not able to, let him not for that cause be a burden unto himself. Because that many women and virgins and veiled brides have been entrusted unto him, and they come unto thee one by one and receive thy blessing. And so we have a canon right here. And again, what Carthage is doing isn't exactly what Alexandria is doing. You have different prestigious sees passing different kinds of canons. And so this seems to be a practice that's going on here where they are allowing an exception, even though he says it's more fitting. We do allow priests to continue having relations with their wives because they're around a lot of women. And so this might aid them as they are a pastor and counseling women. And not even Moses had to deal with this because he had Miriam to reach out to the women, but you have to reach out to both men and women. What's also interesting about these canons of by Athanasius of Alexandria or someone, the next century, is that there's a very similar parallel going on here with how they describe marital relations and wine. Okay. Why is this important? Well, we also fast from wine and meat during certain seasons. We fast from marital relations, meat, and wine. And what you see in this kind of vision that's going on here in Alexandria is that when it came to marital continence in these canons, the monk, it was not optional. Obviously, the monk is not having relations. Bishops, optional. Presbyters, optional. Deacons, optional. Lay, of course, optional. But when it comes to wine, it's kind of quite similar here. The monk doesn't drink wine in these canons, by the way. Of course, you're going to find other examples where monks do drink wine in moderation, but in these canons, they do not. The bishop is to drink either no wine or just 1 to 2 glasses. The presbyters, no wine, but limit to 1 to 2 glasses. Deacons, wine is fine. Just don't be a drunkard. Laity, it's fine. Don't get drunk. So you see a parallel going on here with marital relations, where the bishop, and even though the monk is not partaking, there are exceptions for bishops and presbyters to have wine. And then we, of course, have this famous story of Synesius of Cyrene, and he said, I will not become a bishop when he's being appointed by the Patriarch of Alexandria if I have to put my wife away. I will not give up my wife. I will not refuse what's due to her. And we have historical evidence that he had a couple kids actually after he became bishop. So they would allow this bishop to continue having relations, which actually fits quite well with the canon that I just said. Remember, this is the same Alexandria region where he is able to continue having relations at the right times, right? Fasting before the divine liturgy and the appointed services. So these are similar patterns that are going on here. And I would argue that in the East, there's different areas with different sorts of customs going on until you get to the 5th and 6th century. Socrates in his church history account says, I myself have learned of another custom in Thessaly. If a clergyman in that country, after taking orders, should sleep with his wife, whom he had legally married before his ordination, he would be degraded. In the East, indeed, all clergymen and even bishops themselves abstain from their wives. Yes, by this time, most bishops, I would say, are celibate. But they do it by their own accord and not by the necessity of any law, for there have been many bishops who have had children by their lawful wives during their episcopate, and they're not being deposed. So he's seeing this in the 5th century, that, this custom is in other places, but in a lot of the East, bishops are actually still having kids. You see this happening. And of course, St. Epiphanius will say the same thing, that there's areas where presbyters and deacons are having kids and they're not listening to his canons. Now, Ben would say that he's referencing Canon 3. I don't think Canon 3 of Nicaea is talking about that, and there's a good case that it's not. And so I don't think St. Epiphanius is referring to Canon 3 of Nicaea. I think there's just like local customs in different places going on there. And then when we get to the 6th century, we have imperial legislation that's coming in by Justinian. And he's basically saying that if you're a bishop, you can no longer have like kids and grandkids, and that you will from here on be basically celibate. Now, it had a clause where people that were not in this situation could continue becoming bishops. He wasn't going to depose him, but he begins implementing this practice where presbyters and deacons can still live with their wives and have relations, but the bishops will definitely be practicing continence, and they're not to be living with their wife. And so this is what Trullo is definitely patterning itself after, is Justinian's legislation. And I think these patterns are happening throughout the East. It continues with Justinian's code. The process toward episcopal celibacy, therefore, started very early in the history of Christianity and intensified during the 4th century under the reign of Emperor Justinian. By the way, this is Archbishop Peter, whom we talked about earlier. when celibacy became mandatory, married bishops constituted a minority. This can be inferred from the fact that there's no record of hostile reaction. So when Justinian enforces this code, it really wasn't hostile because a lot of the bishops were already practicing this custom. But the presbyters and deacons were not held to this standard within this imperial code. And of course, it's not ecclesial code. This was a way to sort of unify practices, so certain, bishops and presbyters aren't being deposed for different living situations. And so Dr. David Hunter says this: on the issue of clerical marriage, the council formally, that'd be Trullo, codified the essential elements of the previous Eastern tradition, especially the legislation of Justinian I, and explicitly signaled its divergence from the Western practice. Of course, there's ample evidence of different councils in the West, the Latin West, codifying that from subdeacons all the way up to bishops, there will not be any relations. That's a permanent practice of continence. And so that's basically what I think is happening with Trullo. It's not only codifying what was happening a century before that with Justinian, but Justinian is enforcing something that's already taking place, where many bishops are already practicing celibacy. They're being pulled from monastic ranks oftentimes, but the presbyters and deacons are held to a different standard. And Father William Saunders, a Catholic priest, he's the dean of the Notre Dame Graduate School of Christendom College. He follows the same narrative. So you'll find Catholic scholars who are following the same narrative that I am presenting, that in the Eastern Church, a distinction was made between bishops and other clergy as to whether they had to be celibate. Emperor Justinian's Code of Civil Law forbade anyone who had children or even nephews to be consecrated a bishop. And the Council of Trullo mandated that a bishop be celibate. And so he's basically connecting Justinian's law with the Council of Trullo and the patterns that were going on before that. He also thinks that the Paphnutius story, he mentions it as actually a real story, whether that is or not, but he seems to think that it actually is real, and that caused a shift in the East. We could continue talking about other references. Like, for example, Ben was talking about oftentimes, like, what's the theology behind continence? And what's interesting is that Pope Innocent and the papal decretals will talk about the altar being polluted, basically, if a priest were to have marital relations with his wife. So, and by the way, there's been scholarship to show that they were not always really having daily mass in these places in the West in the 4th century, that it was actually kind of rare to have daily mass. And they're basically arguing that, if you're having relations on Monday and you're going to be serving as a priest on Sunday, that the altar is being polluted by that. And they use the Latin word, pollutus or something like that. I have a slide, but it's on a different presentation there. And so there is this theology that's kind of popping up in the West of polluting the altar if you're having marital relations at any point. Whereas the East doesn't quite develop it that way. Though you can find a kind of a wide variety of thoughts going on there. And so I think that this is a big thing going on here. It's also interesting that Coccini, where Ben, scholarship that Ben relies quite a bit on, Coccini ignores approaching texts uncritically. This is coming from a journal article by Kevin Doyle. He's, the Pope is misquoting Ephesians 5:27. He's misunderstanding continence for the Old Testament priests, where he views that there's no hint anywhere of protracted continence being required for those in the priesthood, or even like temporary continence. It just kind of depends on how we define that. There's a footnote with his article that says only the rabbinic directive here is that the high priest was to be separated from his wife the week before Yom Kippur. And so we actually don't know exactly how the priests in the Old Testament were abstaining from their wives. There's a lot of scholarship that could be investigated on that matter. But there's a little bit of pushback going on for even the basis for that kind of claim. And we also should, we could talk about St. John Chrysostom, which we might get to more in the dialogue. I'm not sure how much time I have left because I don't even know when I started there.
You have 6 minutes.
Okay, perfect. That's great. So we could also talk about Saint Epiphanius. I don't know, Ben. I don't know if Ben brought him up in his article or not. He's oftentimes brought up, but yeah, you brought him up in the presentation though. What is it interesting that Saint Epiphanius is brought up because he does sometimes kind of like make claims that, like, when he's trying to say something, like when it comes to like icons, that bishops don't always listen to him. Not everyone paid attention to me, actually, only a few. And so he could be actually, when he's talking about there being a custom, about there being permanent continence among the higher orders, and that there's, presbyters and deacons who are not listening to me and they have different rules in other lands, or at least they are not complying. It's a very similar pattern to how he talks about with icons. It's also interesting that he has a different view of remarriage even after a divorce. If you divorce for a certain particular reason, for example, if there's adultery, he actually allows a second marriage to take place, which is kind of interesting, right? When second marriages were actually not that popular in the early church, it wasn't popular. It was much more encouraged to be continent after your first marriage, even if your spouse died. But he allows that, which is interesting. And so St. Epiphanius is a interesting figure. Let's just put it that way when it comes to the icons. It's also interesting that, like, Ben in one of his articles talks about St. Epiphanius going against the Catholic Church when it comes to icons. And so that he's actually going against the majority of the church. So when we bring up an example like him, we do have to be careful that sometimes he can be a little exaggerated. He may have views that are a little bit different than the West or the East. It really depends. That's why it's sometimes an interesting conversation. We're talking about different customs taking place in different prestigious sees in the ancient church. Now, when it comes to connecting that back with Pope Innocent, St. John Chrysostom actually did not think that if a husband and wife had marital relations, that they should skip out on church. Why? Because they were kind of like using that as an excuse. This is what Chrysostom basically says to those couples. How do you dare to excuse yourself from prayer after you have enjoyed the company of your own wife? Although this has no blame at all. Have you not heard Paul saying marriage is honorable in the bed undefiled? Because you can kind of take this sort of like, marital relations and bringing that into the presence of God. And you can take that and distort that a little bit. And so he's like, no, you can still be in the presence of God. You can still come to church. You can still pray, even if you've had marital relations. And so there's got to be kind of a little bit of a balance going on here. Of course, there's definitely a higher reality. We fast from food. We fast from wine. We fast from relations before the divine liturgy, right? Because we're trying to be elevated in our state of prayer, and this applies to the priest as well. But the altar isn't defiled or polluted, or there's no imperfections, as Ben uses in his article, an imperfection of the priest if he's had relations with his wife on Monday and then celebrates the divine liturgy on Sunday. And I would like to end with a quote by C.S. Lewis, which is something that I think we can all agree upon. This quote comes from his book Miracles, talking about how people are like questioning the joys of heaven because they cannot have like marital relations in heaven. And he compares it to like a child who is trying to like imagine a life without chocolate. And so he's kind of like, man, can you have, when he's trying to understand that couples have a higher experience than eating chocolate, he's like, well, can you have chocolate while having marital relations? And he doesn't get it that, well, it's like you could, but why would you want to? Because they're being elevated to a higher experience. You've got eating chocolate, then you've got the marital embrace, but then you have the angelic life of heaven, which is the highest way of life. And so our modern world doesn't understand that our own joy can come from just a life in God. And so Ben and I are very much on the same page that the angelic life is the highest way of life. It's eschatological, really. It points to us not actually having relations anymore, as our Lord says, because we are finding our joy completely in him. It doesn't mean that marital relations is bad or chocolate is bad, but we're being elevated to a higher level. And so the life of the monk and those who embrace it, like a bishop, or even couples at times, it points to us being able to find enjoyment in God, beyond these pleasures of this world. And that's important because many people in wealthy areas, particularly America, spend their retirements and spend a big part of their life thinking that I don't have meaning unless I have these things. And I think it ruins much of our witness to our joy in Christ, that if the older that we get, let's say we move into our 40s, 50s, and 60s and 70s, if we can be more willing to give up our pleasures in order to be missionaries, to share the gospel with other parts of the world, to go to the places where there's Islam, and being able to separate from our spouses for a year or years, the same way that they do in military, I think that would be a beautiful thing. And so I do think that this is a discussion that needs to be had, that marital continence can be a beautiful thing. It can be temporary, but as you get older and older, I mean, we're all going to be eventually, continent, because we're going to die, and we're going to hopefully be in heaven and not continent in hell. All right. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
All right, Kyle, thank you for that. Those were beautiful. I enjoyed the closing there. Gentlemen, do you want to take a 5-minute break, or are you just ready to go right into the dialogue portion?
I'm good to go.
All right. So we'll have 30 minutes of just free dialogue, and I'll step out and just manage the live chat. And at this point, to the audience, you can start asking your questions, and I'll get those ready. And with that, maybe Kyle, do you want to start with just asking any questions that you have for Ben, or if you want to pitch it to Ben, Ben can start. What do you want to do, Kyle?
Oh, I can let Ben can get started. That's fine. I actually think I might need a little sip of water. I was trying to fly there.
All right. Ben, when you start talking, I'll just start the timer.
Okay, sure. Yeah, no, great presentation, Kyle. Thanks for sharing that. I appreciate it. It was awesome. I guess my first question, because I think, what we really need to nail down in this discussion is basically what is the impetus for clerical continence, right? Like what is the historic justification for it? So I just want to read from Pope Saint Syracuse and then the Council of Trullo, the two quotes I had on my screen, right? So Saint Syracuse, representing the Eastern tradition, or sorry, the Western tradition. Keep in mind, he's not just a Latin, he's a saint of the Eastern Orthodox Church. This is the shared patrimony of both the Catholic and Orthodox churches. This is not just the West. We're not just thinking the West and the East. These are the shared inheritance of the church. And what he says is like you mentioned, he says, would an impure man dare to soil what is holy when holy things are for holy people, right? So that's almost his impetus for this perpetual continence mandate. And we see the same imagery showing up in the writings of Pope St. Innocent, right? Pope St. Leo the Great, right? All of these saintly pontiffs of, the both Catholic and Orthodox churches, expressing this idea. And then we come to the Council of Trullo, and Trullo says something interesting in its explanation for temporary continence, right? So obviously it says that they who assist at the divine altar, right, they should be absolutely continent when they are handling holy things, right? That's the language. And it explains, says, in order that they may be able to obtain from God what they ask in sincerity, right? So there almost seems to be implicit in Trullo, right? If there was an uncharitable reader reading this, he might almost detect a hint of Donatism in this way of framing things, that there's almost a risk that if you have marital relations in relation to the altar, you're not going to obtain from God, right, what you're asking in all sincerity, right? That's why it says he must be absolutely continent in order that he might be able to obtain from God what they ask in sincerity. Obviously, I wouldn't want to read Trullo in that way, but I can't help but detect still at least not a disagreement with the Western teaching on this idea that marital relations in some way are, that word I used, unfitting, right? That's the word I prefer to use. But in the language of Saint Syracuse, right, he would say impure or imperfections in relationship to the altar. So I just kind of wanted your thoughts. Like, do you think that is wrong, blasphemous, heretical? Do you think there's room for that? Or do you think there's somewhere like in the middle? Like, I just kind of want to know, like, what are your thoughts on that justification for clerical continence?
Yeah, I mean, it's always interesting when you do theology and you want to try to unite the two. I mean, I've spent years in ecumenical theology trying to unite everything. And I mean, I think there's ways to sometimes do that and do that effectively, because oftentimes you can see similar comments by later Western saints or later Eastern saints, or by Orthodox person or a Catholic person. And so it does get a little bit complicated, like how you unite theology when there might be dominant sort of themes on how they develop East and West, but then you see kind of a splash here and there of different things going on there. And so the question is like, well, what's kind of like the theology behind it? And I think there is a little bit of a Western tendency that developed in the West. And I don't have the canon in front of me, but the real popular code of canon law continues to, in the Middle Ages, continues to follow this very much this kind of line of thinking that if you're having relations, that it's polluting the altar. And you kind of even gave the example of like, we of course, and I think there would be definitely agreement there that like our Holy Theotokos has been elevated by being the God bearer, and so it would be unfitting for her to continue having relations when she's become the Ark of the Covenant. But of course, we have not become the Ark of the Covenant in the same sense. Otherwise, if you follow that logic, then every single Christian would have to be continent constantly to receive the Eucharist, because you are receiving from the altar the cup, right? I mean, you are receiving what the great gift of the Eucharist. And so if we carry that theology a little bit too far, if the priest is handling these things, I need who has to be continent at all times. Maybe I should be too, and that's where some of these heretical groups went with their thinking. Of course, the Roman Catholic Church doesn't go that direction because they're also trying to create balances. The East is also trying to create these similar sets of balances, and I think that the East tends to go in the direction of like it's fitting for like ascetical purposes, like to show self-control. And you mentioned this as well, like fasting throughout Scripture amplifies our prayers in a sense, but it doesn't mean that we're fasting all the time, because there's plenty of times for feasting as well. So all throughout the Old and New Testaments, people are called to pray and to fast, like all of God's people. And so we do that during Lent. Those who are in Persia do it during the Nineveh fast. I mean, there's different customs going on there with fasting where people want to be heard by God. And so I think when the priest, like at Trullo, who may have had relations on Monday, but they're offering up the sacrifice on Sunday, I don't think that takes away from their prayer, because they're still fasting. I mean, they could be fasting from relations on Wednesdays, Fridays, Saturdays, Sundays, 4 days of the week at least, probably more than that. When you take the feast days and the busy life of a priest, but there seems to be an openness for procreation with priests and deacons in certain parts of the East. And this, of course, I don't believe is a 50-50 thing. It can kind of sound like 50-50, but the East is significantly bigger with its sees and its bishops and population. And so with these differing customs, I think that there are definitely patterns of Trullo happening there. Trullo codifies it, and that the priest's offering through fasting is fitting. It's ascetical, it's eschatological, but it's not required at all times because there is no polluting of the altar.
Right. Yeah, no.
There's a lot that could be said there, but I hope that's
I know. There's so many things that I want to talk about. It's unfortunately we have a limited time. I guess just like one final comment on this that I wanted to make is just the point that I was kind of trying to get at is that it seems like in a lot of, like, I've read through, I believe it was Adam DeVille. I don't know how to pronounce his last name.
Dr. Adam DeVille. I got his book. He edited like a whole book for people that would like to know married priests in the Catholic Church.
Yes.
And the whole book's not like advocating for that, but it's scholarship though.
Yeah, it's definitely a book, I think, if people want to get both sides of the story. But one thing I noticed in that book was there seemed to be this tendency, like this idea that marital relations, in a sense, pollute the altar, if we want to use that, bad imagery, so to speak. There was a statement that not only is that theology different, right, that's just kind of a thing that the East and West disagree about, but that theology is like blasphemous, right? That this idea, which, goes back to at least the 4th century, so well before the Great Schism, right? That this idea that was believed by all these saints, doctors of the church, canons, that not only is it just incorrect, but that it's actually blasphemous, that it is heretical, right? That was very much the sense I got from that book. And the point that I just want to make is that I don't see that.
It does say that somewhere in the book.
I'm not saying it makes that claim directly. I'm saying that's the impression I got.
Oh yeah, I didn't get that impression.
Okay, maybe
that they were the critique that I got was that there's a misunderstanding of the practice of the priests in the Old Testament, and that's getting misapplied by popes that like mistaken sort of exegesis, and then it leads to these sorts of tendencies. So I thought that they were a little bit, yeah, I didn't get that impression.
Okay, sure. Maybe that's that's maybe where you can help me out here. Because basically the point I'm getting at is that it seemed to be that idea was very sharply criticized at the very least, right? Whereas the point that I just kind of wanted to make was that I don't see that theology being criticized prior to the schism. Like, I don't see the Council of Trullo criticizing this theology. I don't see any Eastern saints criticizing the theology. And so while perhaps a case could be made that there were different disciplines emerging in the East, especially after the 4th century, it doesn't seem there's a different theology emerging in the East. It seems the theology is identical. Both East and West are in agreement. Marital relations are in some sense polluting the altar. The difference is in the discipline, the practice. What do we do about that? In the East, it's temporary continence is the solution to that. In the West, perpetual continence is the solution to that. But both East and West seem to be in agreement that there is a problem where continence needs to be a solution. I think it's also interesting. This is related to a question, just so we can get more into some of the other historical matters. It seemed.
Wait, is it my turn to ask a question? Are you asking me another question, or I get to ask?
Sorry, you can comment on that if you want, but I was going to go into a different comment. But please go ahead.
So is the only reason I'm asking is that question going to change the subject, or?
Let me just step in really quick. Okay. So I paused the time. Yeah, basically, I want this to be free flowing. So if Kyle, you ever feel like, oh, this is kind of, maybe Ben's dominating, don't be hesitant to say so, and you can cash that out. Okay.
Yeah. Please talk over me.
We're not having examination. It's just kind of like what I mean. Honestly, a big part of his presentation was on the theology, sort of like that theology behind. And we didn't discuss that a ton in our sort of preparations. We were talking, which is totally fine to talk about that. I've got stuff that I could have responded to that a little bit more strongly, but I would like to actually do more work on that as well when it comes to like the Old Testament to New Testament to patristic era, and what does it mean for the altar to be polluted? How much is some of these early figures misreading some of this Old Testament fasting concepts with the priesthood? I would like to do more work on that. And then I also have things prepared that I could have talked a little bit more about that. But that aside, we're kind of talking about that again. And so I would like to talk about part of it, the history, because those were the biggest claims of the debate was really, is Trullo departing historically? And there can be different theological reasons given, but and so I was going to ask you, had you considered or read those canons by Saint Athanasius, which may not be by him, but they could be by him? Had you encountered those canons, and what did you think about those canons?
I'm sure I've encountered them. They were not fresh on my mind. Those are the ones that you said they were the 5th, 6th century.
No, I said fourth, 5th. So like
4th, 5th, those
anywhere between like 350 to 450, maybe 475. Different scholars place these canons. Something that actually could be legitimately by Saint Athanasius, like writing in the 350s, 60s.
Yes.
There's a lot in the context of those canons that actually kind of feel older. They sound very similar to the canons of Laodicea, I believe. Mm-hmm. A lot of similar types of like rules. And so scholars don't really want to put them much farther than that. But it's an interesting conversation because it's in the Alexandria region, where also there's other examples of the person who's saying, hey, I'm going to have kids. Can I use this right? And they give him an exception. It seems to me that exception seems similar to that canon, where it's fitting to be continent, but we allow a priest to continue having relations.
And that was the one where that option of continence was only for priests and deacons, right? The option for bishops, that option was not provided.
It just uses the phrase priests and deacons. And we do have to be careful. I think both of us have to be careful whenever we're reading texts from different parts of the world by different authors. How they use the word priest can be used differently. Mm-hmm. Sometimes they use the word priest, and it can be referencing bishop and presbyters.
Right. Sometimes
they're even using it. Sometimes they're using it just for bishops, and other times they're using it even for laity. I believe that Origen does this. So it's kind of interesting when we use that word priest. But I think reading through that whole document, it does seem to me that the word priest is being used for both bishop and presbyter.
Okay. Yeah, I would probably have to read that document more closely to see that. I mean, one thing that was coming to my mind as you were going through that, especially the stuff about St. Clement, I find that to be very fascinating, the St. Clement of Alexandria stuff, because I guess there has to be a point made about, right, whether or not Trullo deviated, because if the argument is that full marital rights for bishops, priests, and deacons were allowed going back to the apostles, then that would mean that the Council of Trullo deviated when requiring celibacy for bishops. Right. So I guess a clarifying question would just be, do you think the Council of Trullo deviated from the apostolic practice by requiring celibacy for bishops? Or do you think the Eastern practice originally was always to mandate continence for bishops, perpetual continence for bishops, and the allowance was only for priests and deacons?
Yeah, that's always an interesting question. Like, what did the apostles actually pass on? Is that what you're kind of asking? Like,
yeah, because I think one thing that just came to my mind is that the one way to interpret Clement, and you kind of gestured at this, is that he is allowing marital rights for bishops and priests, but he doesn't mention deacons. And then same too, we see that showing up in these canons you mentioned from Athanasius, where perhaps it could be interpreted that bishops are being implied to being allowed marital rights, but they're not mentioned. So perhaps that could be a continuation, this idea from Clement to Athanasius. You kind of see where I'm going with that?
Yeah, it could go either way. Yeah, each document's kind of a little bit different how they use the word priest, and it does seem like they're talking about bishops and presbyters there. And I think there are times where in that document it makes a difference. Yeah, and I'm also interested. So in your translation of St. Clement, it translates it as priests, deacons, laity.
Oh yeah, sorry, that's me. Yes, it should be.
That's your translation.
Did I do that? I think I might have done that. Yeah.
Okay. In the Greek, it's presbyter.
Yes.
And deacon, which is important because the word if the word priest can sometimes be used for bishops and presbyters, that's important. Particularly, I mean, Archbishop Peter in his journal article by St. Vlad's in 91 makes a similar case that there's a lot of patterns for Trullo. Like there's Trullo patterns happening before Trullo. Like it's not. It's like it's codifying what's been, but not necessarily always dominant. I mean, it could be. There could be a variety of customs, is what he's comfortable with. But he does think that there is, by the 4th century, a dominance of celibate bishops.
Yeah.
And so we could talk about that. But I want to answer your question about what do I think, because that's a kind of a little bit of a different thing. So I think when we talk about apostolic tradition, it can get a little dicey, like where we draw like the lines and where we draw the evolution, particularly like where it gets a little tricky too is even how presbyters and bishops are used. Sometimes it's the same word in the New Testament. And then by the time we get to St. Ignatius of Antioch, of course, he's using bishop as a separate office from presbyter. So there's a whole sort of rich discussion around that because Trullo's making a difference between those two offices. So that it gets into that kind of conversation a little bit. So I do think that the apostles probably were so surrendered to their mission and going out to the world that sometimes maybe they had their wife, sometimes they didn't, that they were just so focused on that and that Christ was getting ready to come back that they sort of just dropped all other priorities. And so they were not interested at that point probably in having more children. Now, when I say apostles, I'm talking about maybe like the 12, maybe not the 70. Perhaps some of the 70 who became bishops who aren't quite, I mean, they're disciples, but they're not really one of the 12. They go out and they become sort of local bishops. This is why we have like a lot of traditions of like, Saint Zacchaeus becoming a bishop and Saint Lazarus becoming a bishop. Were some of the next generation, like Timothy and Titus, were they continent after? I would lean towards that in the early church, those relations were allowed. But the apostles, the 12, went out because they were much more missionary focused, did not. And then from that, different customs rose up in different prestigious sees on this practice of continents.
Gotcha. That helps definitely to clarify your view. I guess then I would ask my question. What did you think about my point that Clement of Alexandria, if he's in fact interpreted in the way that we suppose here, would be the only piece of evidence for pre-Nicene clerical non-continence? I know you brought up a lot of sources. I wasn't tracking all the dates. I wasn't sure if you were able to bring up a counterexample to that. But what do you think about that point that I made? I can clarify that more.
That he's the only one that brings it up. I mean,
he's
pretty. First of all, we should say that he's pretty early, right?
Sure.
I mean, he's writing this in 198 to 215, so he's even one of our first commentators on this question, right? And he doesn't go the direction of like where Tertullian goes, who ends up in a sect that no longer has relations with, like, no one has relations, right? So he is one of our earliest, which I do think is important, particularly if I think, if 1 Corinthians 7, the more plausible reading is that's applying to laity and presbyters. If that's the more plausible reading, which I think it is, and then you take this text, one of the earliest, and connect it with that, I think that's interesting. I also think it's interesting that the text that I brought up that Coccini said is an echo of Trullo, and this would be before Nicaea. Of course, now this is the pseudo-apostolic collection of apostolic canons, circa 300 AD. This would be pre-Nicene. Obviously, this is not a saint or a church father. This is much more of an apocryphal text. But Coccini does admit that not only is the more plausible reading basically the one that echoes Trullo, that the presbyter only abstains at certain times. The Greek, how it gets translated is he would abstain in a certain way. And Coccini, who's on your, he's advocating, he's on your side. He thinks this text leans in my direction, in the Trullo direction.
Mm-hmm.
And that it was quickly translated into Latin, Coptic, and Arabic, and Ethiopian, and that they were happily received this text because it showed a pattern of what they were already doing.
Hmm.
So now I would like to make one more comment on that, how we use apocryphal texts. Are you comfortable using apocryphal text sometimes as a historical witness to something that's true, even if they've got heresy baked into these or it's apocryphal?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We do it sometimes with icons, with the Acts of John.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we're not saying that this is like a father or a saint, or that these canons should enter into our official canon law, like,
right,
our canonical tradition, but they could witness to a pattern that actually is present in all these places where this text gets translated, and Coccini admits that.
Sure.
So when you combine that with Clement, I do think that there's a little bit more going on there. And then if you follow through with right after Nicaea, if you take these, Athanasian canons, you can see like a connected pattern.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. No, thanks. That definitely helps clarify. I guess one thought I had on the 1 Corinthians 7 thing, I think it's a very interesting argument to bring up. One issue I took, though, with reading 1 Corinthians 7 as applying indiscriminately no qualifications to all, laymen, bishops, priests, deacons, was his counsel to the unmarried and to people whose spouses have died, which is that if they cannot handle, if their temptations are too great, then they should marry. Right. Obviously, I don't know what you thought about my interpretation. I would say the patristic interpretation of 1 Timothy 3, which is that Paul forbids clerics from remarrying after the death of a spouse. It would at least seem to suggest that 1 Corinthians 7 has implied qualifications for clerics, at least in the case of the death of a spouse, which to me suggests that 1 Corinthians 7 cannot just be read in an unqualified way as applying to clerics. What would your thoughts be on that?
Oh, I see. So you have the first example of like the husband and wife fasting, maybe trying to fast for life. They fail, and then Satan gets a foothold. And so he's like, no, only fast for a season. And then you've got the second text where like there's widows. He prefers that the older widows stay single, but if they're like a young widow, if they're burning, it's okay for them to get married. Would that apply to the clerics of the church? And
oh, you go ahead.
Right? Is that clear? I'm just making sure I'm clear.
Yeah, I don't think Paul distinguishes between old and young widows in 1 Corinthians 7. I know he does in 1 Timothy.
Yeah, I could be.
But yes, essentially, yes, that he seems to be saying, regardless of who, like if your spouse dies and you can't handle this life of continence, then you should get married. Whereas in 1 Timothy 3, we see the exact opposite counsel being given to clerics. And so there seems to at least be some implied qualification in 1 Corinthians 7. That's kind of the point I'm making.
Yeah. No, that's a great question. Like if I'm reading it that way, then could a presbyter after his wife die in the 1st century get married again?
Mm-hmm. Obviously,
that's been argued by some people in the scholarship. And what's interesting about that, I if I knew I was going to answer that question, there's definitely some parts that I've in my research were reading about that specific thing, and there seems to be definitely some exceptions, and definitely in the earliest periods of this, but it definitely becomes the canon where everybody's on the same page. We don't allow a marriage after a second marriage of a cleric. In those canons of St. Athanasius that I mentioned, there is a canon about a deacon, particularly if he's a young deacon and his wife dies, and he goes off and he gets married again. He does get penalized. He goes from deacon to reader if he does that. Particularly if he's like a young man. Yeah. And so it's kind of like a quasi punishment if he does that, which I just thought it was kind of an interesting take. I would need to do more research on the prevalence of like clerics like entering a second marriage. I've read a little bit about that on the topic, of course, like divorce and remarriage. Sometimes those discussions are related. Sometimes those discussions are related because if a priest's wife dies, did they ever get married again? It's an interesting question. Were they allowing that in the 1st century? I don't know. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, no, thanks for answering that. I guess, one way that my mind is just going is like, if we don't have that 1 Corinthians 7 interpretation that you brought forward, and we only have, a possible reading of St. Clement, though, like I said, I think there's perhaps a case to be made that Clement is not teaching clerical non-continence. And even if he is, he's only teaching it for priests and deacons. Well, I'm just explaining kind of like the way I'm thinking about this, right?
Yeah.
And so if we only have the case of Clement, and he's even seemingly contradicted by Origen in the same time, in the same place, right? And then we also have, granted, yes, these apocryphal writings from the, just before the Council of Nicaea, which once again, I don't think that's nothing. I fully agree. It's important historical evidence. But the way that I look at it is, if those are the only two pieces of pre-Nicene evidence we're operating with, it seems the burden of proof in my mind shifts a little bit.
But there's not a lot, but there's not a lot. There's not even a lot there before Nicaea. Sure. Not a ton there, but it seems like, like when we've established the biblical precedent of this underlying theology, right? That's kind of why I focused a lot of my beginning presentation about this underlying theology. We have that precedent of the apostles themselves, right? The prototypical bishops. Everyone agrees these people lived lives of continence. We have that interesting apostolic mandate. We have, most of the fathers, including, I would say, even Clement himself, attesting to at least some kind of perpetual continence, whether for bishops, priests, and deacons. That it seems to me that that's what, in my mind, shifts the burden of proof, where, okay, the fact that we don't have a lot of compelling evidence of clerical non-continence prior to Nicaea, and that everything we have coming after Nicaea, right, it seems to almost be like responding to existing disciplines, like the story of Paphnutius seems to be responding to something, right? Even the Council of Trullo itself is responding to the Roman discipline, right? It doesn't, to me, there is this development that happens in the East, but it looks to me like that, like a development. And if it's not a development, right, once again, I think we still have that consistent bishops being celibate going back to the apostles, which would obviously be points for Trullo itself, right? Trullo isn't deviating, right, on anything if that's the case. But I don't know if my rambling just kind of made sense there or not, but that's kind of just the way I'm thinking about it. If you want to add any comments to that. Oh yeah, I mean, I definitely see like where you're coming from. One of the questions that we have to always be careful of, or one of the things we have to be careful of, is trying to always make everything perfectly harmonized and synthesized, when sometimes there is a true diversity of custom going on there. Like maybe a real theology being passed on, and some real apostolic customs being passed along, but within that, there could be a diversity of customs within the different prestigious sees around the world. And so that's basically what I'm arguing, is that there was a difference of custom, and the East, perhaps because it's bigger, perhaps because they also had a lot more monasteries, where they could pull like holy men from, because I was even reading that, like, even in the 4th century in the West, there weren't nearly as many monasteries. So you've got this issue, of course, of like you got this issue of holiness, like the holiness of clergy. It's a real thing. It's a real issue. And so the West didn't have as many monasteries, and so applying it to all those in major holy orders allows you to have sort of like this monastic-like phenomenon. Whereas in the East, if there's like, and there's a lot of research to show that there's like just monasteries all over the place popping up in Iraq and Iran and just all over the place. And you've got a lot of people who are like radical because the people aren't being martyred anymore, right? There's a reason why this conversation could be happening in the 4th century. The martyrs are going away. Monasticism is replacing the martyrs as a sign of holiness. How do we deal with the holiness of our clergy? It was a big question. And I think even Cardinal Sarah was talking about this even in 2022. Cardinal Sarah, Robert Sarah, who I have a lot of respect for, by the way. He said, like, if the West were to ever change its teaching, and allowed married priests, it would be in some ways way more devastating than how he thinks how the East practices it, because he believes that the East has maintained a very strong sense of holiness in its monks compared to the West. This is his direct comments. And I think that comment that he's making in 2022 or whatever actually is related to this, to what's happening in the 4th century.
Yeah, it's very fascinating.
But I could develop that a little bit more in an essay or something.
Yeah,
I was hoping to have a few more essays written before we even had this debate, but we weren't like, hey, let's have this debate in 3 months or 6 months. It was like, hey, let's do this debate in like 2 weeks. It's like, oh, all right.
The better.
Let's go for it. So it was a bit of a thrill, because this is not an area that I like focus a ton on. I focused a little bit on, but I was mostly just responding to your article, which I thought was heavily reliant on Caccini. And I think that there's been good pushback where we think that maybe he's gone a little bit too far. That's the opinion. So that's what I'm representing.
Awesome.
All right, gentlemen, that is 30 minutes. Thank you for really nice dialogue. Also, I appreciate just how, like, I think, I don't know if I mentioned this at the beginning, but this isn't meant to be like the final word on this topic. And I appreciate the fact that both of you guys were saying like, oh yeah, I need to look into that, or I need to explore this. It's a good like intellectual spirit to have. There's a lot of humility here. And so I'm very happy to see it. So there's just a few questions or comments that people made, and I want to get your thoughts on them. So first, this is for Ben. Bob the Buildist said, I'm 13 minutes behind catching up, but I want to point out to Ben that the deacon continence issue is a big debate right now, because canon law does mandate perfect and perpetual continence. Any thoughts on that, Ben?
Yeah, I have seen this. Obviously, I think he's referring to in canon law in the Latin Church. He's talking about the consent of the wife is necessary for ordination. And historically in the Western tradition, the reason for that was because obviously the wife has marital rights. And so the husband can't just say, hey, honey, I'm getting ordained and I'm, getting rid of your marital rights. Like that would obviously violate the Western understanding of, the rights that spouses have over one another's bodies. And so the fact that the wife has to give the consent in order for the ordination to be valid, so the ordination would be invalid if the wife did not give her consent, that existed because of the continence discipline. And so some canon lawyers, I think it's Peter Edwards, I think is the one who wrote an article basically defending that presupposes diaconal continence even in the modern Latin Church. But of course, since it's not enforced, and obviously I would agree with St. Thomas that custom can dictate law, I would say that it's not actually enforced by law because custom dictates law in this case. But I'm not a canon lawyer, so please do not take my opinion on that. Don't go tell your deacon that he needs to separate from his wife, please. That's just, yes, I've heard of this. So, yeah.
Yeah, Kyle, do you want to say anything on that, or?
Well, I mean, it is an interesting point. Like, I mean, one of the trickier issues is how the modern Catholic Church, architecturally and with its kind of quasi loss of minor orders, has blurred distinctions within the church. And so some of these things that we're talking about are related to like where the altar is and where people are and what they touch and how they serve and all these things. So it's a very interesting question, because if you are going to apply it to the deacon, Ben was bringing that up. Well, what about Eucharistic ministers? Who, I mean, they're not just like, they're going behind the rail. Well, there isn't even a rail oftentimes. I mean, you go to a lot of these churches in the burbs, and I've been to a lot of Catholic churches in the burbs. I mean, some of them are horrifically designed. I mean, I went to one where the altar was literally in the center of the church and everything is a circle. So the people are basically all around it. And then there really is no distinction between the spaces.
Yeah.
So it's a very tricky, that's very tricky in itself, right?
Right.
How we think about hierarchy, because there isn't just a hierarchy of orders. There's a hierarchy of how we treat the spaces and the items, and reflects the temple. And so that collapse in many of these churches in the burbs, I do think it causes a type of crisis in a way. I was thinking about this a little bit in this discussion, like, oh man, like this is an interest, like really taking the Latin view seriously and then trying to apply it today. It's like, ooh, this does throw some big curveballs.
Yeah, I would also say the modern concept of, like you mentioned, minor orders have kind of fallen out of favor in the Western Church, and that's true. They created this thing called instituted orders, right, which are actually different from minor orders, and the reason for that is specifically because historically minor orders had things like, you know, some kind of continence requirement. They had these like clerical requirements, and that's literally the reason they created instituted orders, was so that they could like not reinstitute those same requirements, which I think is just pretty silly. So,
well, like subdeacons, I mean, you have like it applying to subdeacons, but like,
right,
like with like servers, I mean, if you're pulling from children, then obviously the expectation is that they're continent. But if you have like older men or older women who are not a subdeacon, they're not like, what are they? Who are they? It creates interesting conversations.
For sure.
All right. The next thing I have here is from Byzantine Catholic, who says, I'm with the Orthodox on this subject, as all faithful Eastern Catholics should be. And I mean, maybe I want to just pitch this to, both of you guys and just ask, like, it seems like this was, and this is why I titled it East and West rather than Catholic and Orthodox, right? Because it seems as if that's the crux. You have these two different traditions, right? It's not necessarily a Catholic Orthodox issue necessarily. I don't know if you agree with that characterization. Maybe let me start with Kyle. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh yeah, I mean, in some sense, I did feel like I was kind of collaborating across the lines. Eastern Catholics, Coptic Orthodox, Canonical Orthodox, Chalcedonian. Anyways, I do think that there is in a sense, a representation of this perspective that goes kind of across the board with the Eastern perspective. I mean, this is why Eastern Catholic priests were giving pushback to his article, because it sounded just like Coccini and Stickler and a lot of that scholarship, which again, a lot of it's good. I mean, as far as like a research topic, I mean, he does write a masterful work. I'm not saying it's not masterful, but one of the issues is that when you draw really strong connections, and all those authors, they say different things at different points that can be a little bit of a wound for Eastern Catholics or Orthodox. When they make a really strong ontological argument that the natural state is permanent continence and that there's no evidence for this in apostolic tradition, like their perspective at Trullo, then when you look at modern, Catholic history for Eastern Catholics, of course, this has been a painful thing for them in lots of ways. I mean, it wasn't until Pope Francis that they overturned allowing married priests in foreign lands like the United States and Australia and other places for Eastern Catholics. And the question could be always like, well, why did they do that? I do think that Pope Benedict, it was in the same camp as Cardinal Sarah and Coccini. He seems to be arguing the exact same lines. And so that's why I think Pope Benedict didn't allow married priests in the United States, and then Pope Francis overturns that. It'll be interesting to see what the future holds. But these things are relevant because just because something looks one way ecumenically right now, or it looks like, things, well, at Vatican II, they were given certain rights and privileges and all that. I mean, what if the future of Catholicism 500, or sorry, like 75 years from now is like super trad, which, I mean, a lot of my trad friends are having lots of babies. I mean, 7,500 years from now, it could be, and they could really try to reinstitute that sort of policy. I mean, Pope, maybe Ben becomes Pope. I don't know. I'm not saying that Ben would institute anything like that. I don't know. It's hard to say, because I think if Cardinal Sarah had become Pope, I think he may have reinstituted that policy, based upon the same scholarship. So that's kind of why it matters for the Catholic world. Of course, it's not the same for the Orthodox world, because we're not united. But when it comes to ecumenical relations, it sure does matter, because Orthodox are watching what happens to Eastern Catholics, and also it matters because Trullo makes a big claim, and if it doesn't have any substance, then that's an issue.
Yeah, no, I think that this is a very important conversation to have, an ecumenical dialogue, especially because one of the things, kind of looking at from like the other side, one of the things I was noticing, like in that volume by Adam DeVille, Married Priest in the Catholic Church, and I kind of brought this up in the discussion, was there was a tendency to not just assert the equality of the Eastern and Western disciplines, but in a sense, the impression I get, and once again, I could be misreading the intentions, but the impression I get was they were making the argument that actually the Eastern discipline, they were kind of arguing the exact same point in reverse. It seemed to me they were arguing for the superiority of the Eastern discipline. They were saying that the fathers of the Western Church completely misunderstood Scripture. They got all these things wrong. They taught all these, things about marriage and sexuality that are false. So to me, it seemed like there was a big attack happening, not just on the modern Catholic Church, but on the Western patristic heritage, which is something that I've noticed is a bit, obviously I've, researched a lot of East-West issues going back to things like the Council of Florence, the Council of Lyons. It just seems like that, in my mind, was very characteristic of, criticisms of Western practices. It wasn't just throwing the contemporary Western practice and theology under the bus, but it was even throwing men like Pope St. Leo the Great, saying he didn't understand the goodness of marriage. Pope St. Cyricus didn't understand the goodness of marriage. That's more so why I think became very passionate about this, was because I sensed an attack not on necessarily the discipline of the West, but on the theology that has historically underlined that discipline, which I think obviously is problematic if we are to have a truly, ecumenical, in the sense of that is truly understood, right? Going back to the ecumenical church, the first millennium, we need to find room for both the Eastern and Western traditions. We can't say one is superior to the other. That's why I kind of, at the very beginning of my presentation, and even a bit throughout, I try to emphasize, right, the East and West, we're not theologically distinct on this, right? We agree with the underlying theological premises. We just practice it differently. And then it just becomes a historical question of, okay, well, which practice is historically more closely related to the ones of the apostles? I think Kyle brought out some very good evidence that, there was a diversity of practice in the East. Obviously I still hold my belief that I think perpetual continence was the norm. But clearly nobody in the first millennium had a problem with, at least at certain points, expressing these disciplines differently. But I just want to focus on, we are united in our theology. And I think that's what's critical moving forward in ecumenical discussions. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Player Paul asked, and whoever knows this, Kyle, Ben, just hop right in once I'm done reading. Does Oriental Orthodoxy match Eastern Orthodoxy's stance on celibacy?
I could Kyle probably know a little bit more about that than me, probably.
Yeah. So what happened at Trullo was already generally the practice among the Coptics and Arminians, and I do need to do more research to get into like super specifics about that. Part of it is like sometimes you run into journal articles that need to be translated, and it's written in Arabic. So there are issues with like, okay, when did this exactly happen? But yeah, I mean, the scholarship that I've read is that one of the reasons why Trullo didn't even look crazy in the East is because these places were already had that pattern where bishops were generally had become celibate, and presbyters and deacons were still using their marital rights and having these times of fasting. So.
All right, here's the last one that I have. It's by Frank C. And he made a comment here, and I just want to get your thoughts. So the only apostles we know, who had a wife were Peter. Even then, it only mentions that he had a mother-in-law. His wife may have died before he was called. Paul and Titus were also celibate. Ben, I wanted to get your thoughts on this, especially because I don't know if you remember a while back on Facebook, we were arguing with a Protestant gentleman, and he was trying to say that Paul later got married as an apostle. I don't know. I don't know if you remember that conversation, but or if you have any thoughts since then, but just curious on the comment and that context.
Sure, yeah. Well, it's interesting. St. Jerome is the one who points out, like, hey, we only know Peter had a wife, so probably all the other apostles weren't married. So I don't think that that's the case. I think probably Peter had a wife. I think probably other apostles had a wife. But I think it is possible that Peter's wife was deceased by the time he began his apostolic ministry. Right? We don't see her come up. We only see the mother-in-law, right? We don't see the wife. She is not mentioned, at least to my knowledge, anywhere else in the New Testament. We don't see her coming up in any traditions later, at least.
Clement. He's in Clement.
Is it?
Well,
she's alive.
He's at her martyrdom.
Oh, really? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'm familiar with that. Okay, well, there you go.
Peter is at his wife's martyrdom.
Oh, okay.
Encouraging her, according to Clement. Yeah.
Oh, very interesting. I didn't know
I was hoping it might make it in the Chosen.
Oh, that would be very interesting. But yeah, obviously with Paul, as far as I'm aware, Clement is the only one who says that Paul was married, and that but Clement says he was a widower. So as far as I'm aware, all the other fathers say Paul was celibate. There's actually Coccini. This is obviously, people can criticize Coccini's work, but obviously we all agree it's a masterful work of scholarship. One of the benefits is he goes over all the patristics on what every church father thought about the marriages of every single apostle. It's actually quite extensive. And you can see that there is like zero consensus. Like the only consensus is that Peter was married. John was not. That's the only consensus on an apostle not being married, is that the apostle John was not. The reason given for that is the fact that he was entrusted with the Blessed Virgin Mary. Interestingly enough. And then obviously Paul, most think that he was celibate, but the also unanimous teaching is that they were all continent regardless of marital status. So I have not seen a single dissenting voice from that. I don't know about Titus being celibate. I haven't seen anything about, because I think Coccini only goes over the 12. I don't think he mentions he was over Titus. I'd have to double check, but that's kind of my thoughts on that. So yes, no evidence that as I'm aware of Paul marrying after his apostolic call. So yeah,
I haven't run into that. One question that I had run into in this discussion a little bit in my mind is just also like in biblical scholarship, like how old the apostles even were when Jesus called them, which is an interesting question. I mean, were they teenagers? Were they in their 20s? Was John super young? Was Peter super old? There's a lot of interesting questions, particularly when you have the traditions of them having kids, like for example, the Bishop James, our Lord's stepbrother having a kid or whatever. Peter, the tradition of Peter having a kid. It's interesting because it kind of does relate to like how we imagine how old they are. But I'm not saying that any way proves what I'm saying, but it's just an interesting question.
For sure.
All right. We have one final very crucial question asked by Elijah Yossi. Who won? That's all that matters. Okay. So Kyle, I'll let you go first.
I would say that you won, Swan.
Okay. I'll take that.
You and Sarah from Hamilton modeled a debate on the papacy, a few years back, I think on Ubi's channel. It was just very charitable, very, you guys are very complimentary. You set a very good tone. And I think I learned a lot by your example with Seraphim on that debate. So there you go. You won.
Yeah. I like to think that everybody wins because, like I said at the beginning, like I came here, I'm here to learn. Like this subject, I'm still studying. Like I was excited to give my presentation because I wanted to see like what are some objections to like what I'm saying. Like I want to like get to the truth of the matter. So I think everybody wins when we, learn from each other. We, uncover this topic of history that really isn't talked about a lot, at least in like the popular spheres. Like there's a lot of scholarly research on it. but I don't really see it being talked about in a serious way in popular spheres. So yeah, I think the subject is super fascinating. I've thoroughly enjoyed researching it and this dialogue. So I like to think we all win.
Yeah, it's like I
Yeah,
couldn't
and,
like go on YouTube and like copy somebody. You know, when people like they do like a, you say, I'm going to do a sola scriptura debate, and they're gonna go watch Trent Horn, or they're gonna go watch somebody. With this topic, you couldn't just like go online, like watch somebody debate this topic. I mean,
Right.
it isn't one that actually is talked quite a bit. It's referenced, but mostly it's related to the Middle Ages and priestly celibacy and the Pope enacting that, but not really going in depth with this particular era. So it's been fun to talk about it and study it. So thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah.
Of course. And, Kyle, I appreciate your kind comment about my debate with Seraphim. That was like way back, when I was early starting on. And like I said, I've said this before, it wasn't my best debate. But on top of that, it wasn't supposed to be a debate to begin with. There was some like moving around that happened behind the scenes and certain things that happened.
Is this supposed to be a debate? It's a dialogue. So I don't know.
That's right. That's right. So, there's that. But if Seraphim ever wanted to do a round 2, I'm much more prepared this time.
All right.
But anyway, leaving that out, guys, thank you for this conversation tonight. Really appreciate it. And obviously check out Kyle's channel, Barrel Age Faith. And Ben, can you talk about where we can find some of your work?
Yeah, I have a Substack, benjaminjohn.substack.com. I also do have a YouTube channel. It's just called Benjamin John. I may or may not upload videos in the future. We'll see. And I'm also pretty active on Facebook sometimes, so you can look me up. So that's where I'm at.
All right. Well, thank you for that, gentlemen. And that will end the stream for tonight. Anyway, have a good night, everybody. God bless.
Good night.
God bless. Take care.